Good evening. My name is Christine Olgelati, and I am the Dean of Students here at Hagerstown Community College. On behalf of the HEC students, faculty, and staff, it is my pleasure to welcome not only our HEC audience with us tonight in person, but also our friends tuning in via live stream on YouTube from Allegheny College and Frostburg State University. Whether you are with us tonight right here in Kepler Theater or tuning in from online, we are glad that you have chosen to spend some time with us tonight, September 16th, 2021. The United States Constitution was signed into being our country's guiding document on September 17th, 1787. The Constitution has been amended 27 times in the last 234 years. Sadly, our actions as a country have not always aligned with the Constitution. As a public community college with a mission to uplift our local community through education and engagement for all, I am proud that Hagerstown Community College strives to be a beacon of light and an agent of civic change across Maryland. We are pleased to welcome to the stage tonight storyteller Fanny Crawford. Ms. Crawford would take us back to a time when a young America was grappling with realizing the Constitution's vision of creating a democracy in which every person had the right and ability to participate. At HCC here, we also want to thank the League of Women Voters, based right here in Maryland, for their sponsorship of tonight's program and for helping our three colleges to celebrate the 234th anniversary of the U.S. Constitution. At this time, I am pleased to turn the mic over to Ms. Jeannie Massey from the League of Women Voters to open up tonight's program.
Good evening. I am a board member of the State League of Women Voters, and I'm also a board member here in Washington County. I didn't grow up knowing a whole lot about the League of Women Voters, even though it's been around. This year they celebrated the 101st anniversary of it. It was founded out of the culmination of the passage of the 19th Amendment. The women who had worked so hard to get the amendment passed looked around and realized they had created not just an amendment, but an organization that had a great deal of know-how, a lot of connections, and their job wasn't really done because there were so many people in society who had never voted before. And over time, their mission to engage the public as a nonpartisan civic organization grew to embrace the idea that we're really here to empower voters and defend democracy. If you look around the news, if you're into social media, if you look up the League of Women Voters, you'll see that they're active in every state in the country. During the California recall, they were busy trying to help voters know where to go and when to go and how to fill out their ballots. In Ohio, they're actively trying to make sure that the redistricting fight is fair, that the new maps that are drawn after the census will empower all voters to pick politicians rather than politicians picking their voters. We're doing the same here in Maryland. Many leagues are involved in discussion groups, learning about foreign policy or local policy. We have observer corps that go into local government. In fact, some even take teenagers in because we want to help the next generation learn more about how the process works so that people feel comfortable in getting involved. Here in Washington County, we do have some discussion groups that go on. We look at foreign policy in particular, and we're looking forward to a new event that we've not done before in October. October 16th, we're going to do a joint program with the Board of Elections focusing on election security so that the public has a chance to hear exactly what happens behind the scenes. How does the process work so that we can trust it more and feel comfortable knowing that our ballot counts. So I'm going to hand it over to Fanny, and I'm particularly excited about this because as a social studies teacher, I teach stuff like this all the time using print documents. There's no footage of anyone coming out of this era. Perhaps late in life there is through the Great New Deal WPA programs. But this is a really special moment where we get to go back in time and hear the thoughts of someone who lived through interesting times. Isn't that the old blessing? May you live in interesting times? We certainly do now. And we need moments like this to think through how to survive and thrive and build our country into something really beautiful again. Thank you very much.
Well, good evening, folks. I have to confess to being a little confused. My name is Thomas Henry Barnes, and my great-granddaughter is here somewhere in this building, and I thought that she was going to introduce me, but she's not here. So I will just introduce myself. You know my name now, Thomas Henry Barnes, and I'm pleased to be here on this beautiful Thursday evening. In 1942, it's an honor to be celebrating Constitution Day with you. I hope that my few memoirs of my own life and a bit of my family history and trying to connect that information to the Constitution and the amendments will prove entertaining, at least to some extent. I wanted to tell you that I will be using some words that you might not hear every day, or maybe you do. I will use different words to describe my family and my community. I may say black. I may say African American or Afro-American. I may say coloreds. I may even say that word that terrifies so many people that begins with an N, depending on what stories I'm going to tell you tonight. I will change my language a bit. Now, my mother taught me to pay attention to language, so when I think about her, I always wonder if I'm using the right words in the right situations. I usually start my storytelling by talking about my father, and I noticed that the title of this event is called Thoughts on the Constitution from a freed slave, Memoirs of a Free Slave. Now, I am not the freed slave. I need to make that clear. I was freeborn. But my father was born enslaved in Richmond, Virginia. The other person who was very important to me at points in my life and that I've spent a lot of time learning from and thinking about was the great orator, great man, Frederick Douglass, who, of course, was also a freed slave. And I will be sharing some of what I've learned from him and maybe even some of his words as we proceed. So starting with my father, Henry was born enslaved near Richmond, Virginia, on a farm about the year 1818, which, as it happens, was the same year that Frederick Douglass always said that he was born. Neither my father nor Mr. Douglass knew for sure the exact time of their birth because records were not kept that they had any access to. My father was born on this farm in Virginia, but he had very hazy knowledge, very little memory of his parents. My father was taken from the farm very young as a child by a man who came from Hagerstown, Maryland, was an Englishman by birth, who came to Virginia specifically to purchase young colored boys and young men. not usual to the custom of the day, Reverend Barnes taught his enslaved workmen to read and write and calculate, and then had them trained in skilled trades. And their education allowed them to go forth into the community at his direction to work for his neighbors in Hagerstown. Their education allowed them to keep records of the work accomplished and the hours worked and bring those documents home to him so that he might bill his neighbors. And so Mr. Reverend Barnes, as he always called himself, according to my father, was quite a wealthy man, and his wealth was built on the labor of those unpaid black men. Now, my father, Henry, had a difficult time in Hagerstown to start, being so young and taken from his family. But he was educated there and became quite skilled in his work and eventually took great pride in it. Now, about the year 1835, Reverend Barnes, feeling himself growing frail and in poor health, called his 19 enslaved workmen to his bedside in the middle of the night. He told them that as they had served him well and he was now dying, he had determined to liberate them. He gave them each $200 in cash and their manumission papers, their free papers. Now that amount of money, each one of those men was worth at least $1,500 on the slave market. And with the cash that he gave them, that was the bulk of his estate. So Reverend Barnes fully expected that in the morning, when the family, his heirs, had realized what he had done, they would go directly to the courthouse, find a judge to have Reverend Barnes declared insane and incompetent, because what man in his right mind would give away all that wealth? Well, that and the fact that the Fugitive Slave Act had been passed some years before, 1793, I believe, which made it possible for any bounty hunter, any marshal, any aggrieved family member of an incompetent or deceased slave owner to stop a fugitive slave in any state, free state or otherwise, and not infrequently to stop freedmen. And those captured could be sold on the spot or taken back where they came from, if that could be determined. With those two thoughts in mind, Reverend Barnes insisted that the 19 must leave immediately that night. They were to take horses and wagons from the stable, cross the state line into Pennsylvania, and leave the wagons and horses with the man that he had arranged for, and then make their way north with all due speed and caution. He asked that each one of them take the name of Barnes. Well, they agreed to that stipulation and set off immediately. Daybreak found those fugitives over the state line, where they left the wagons and horses as agreed. Some of the men used some of their cash they'd been given to purchase transportation north, but most of them set off on foot. In Lewistown, Pennsylvania, Mifflin County, the men were overtaken by a posse of marshals slave hunters, and heirs of the old man. Lewistown was a known stop on the Underground Railroad, a station, and that's probably why the posse went there. Most of the men escaped, slipped away before they were seen, as the members of the posse searched house by house, field by field. Two of those men, the two that were trapped, Jerry Barnes and my father, Henry, were hidden, protected by the townspeople. Jerry down a water well, and Henry secreted beneath a barn. As the search went on for more than a full day, almost 2 full days, they stayed hidden until the evening of the second day, when the posse moved on, trying to catch up with the other men. The people of the town released the men from their hiding places and examined their manumission papers, finding them in good order, and then learning that these 2 men were more literate than most of the residents of the town, and that they furthermore had skilled trades that would benefit the town. They were invited to settle in Lewistown. My father soon found lucrative employment and married a freeborn woman of the town. Together, they started our family. They had 5 children, only 2 of whom survived beyond the age of 5 years, myself and my brother, Peter. Excuse me while I check my time. My mother, Jane Williams Barnes, was the politician in the family. She had very little education, but she was a skilled mathematician. In spite of not being able to read, she did all her mathematics in her head. She could read the headlines of our local newspaper, the major headlines. But she taught me to listen. She wanted me to pay attention to what people said, men and women, and even children. And she wanted me to observe them and see if I could match up the words with the actions, and if not, possibly figure out why not. But she thought that was important. She was well-schooled in the sense that because she paid attention and listened to people talking about what they read in the newspapers, and my father often read the newspaper to her, she knew a lot about current events. She knew what was happening in Washington, D.C., and it mattered to her. She was always passionate about education, politics, temperance, and what was going on in our community. And that's where my attention to language comes from, because she said you need to pay attention who you're talking to, and you might not use the same words with your friends playing out on the road as you would with Mrs. Schneider, who lives down the street. Now, I went to a school not far from our home. It was a one-room, dilapidated school with no books and very few supplies at all for education. But I did learn the rudiments of reading there. And with my father's help, I became an accomplished reader compared to the other students, and eventually learned to read as well or better than any student in the school of any age. So I would read the newspaper to my mother. And I vividly remember the election campaigns of 1856. There were brass bands marching by our house more than once. And they would assemble with banners unfurled and brass instruments blaring, drums. And as they came by our house, I'd throw my hat in the air, and Mother would say, "Make a joyful noise." And when I shouted, "Huzzah!" those men, Republicans, threw these big copper cents to me, and I gathered them by the handful from the middle of the road. Mother explained that those people were supporting Millard Fillmore, who was the former vice president of the United States, and that the Republicans in general were in favor of schools for our people, and many of them were willing to speak up for abolition and against slavery. Well, just a few days later, another parade approached. Mother grabbed me and Peter under our arms, yanked us into the house, slammed the door and locked it, pulled the curtains and the shutters. I was standing by the window and trying to see what the fuss was about when rocks began to hit our front door and derisive epithets began to hit my ears. And Mother pulled me away from the window and told me that those wanted James Buchanan to be president of the United States, and they said in the news that our people were not really human, that we did not deserve education at all, let alone any sort of citizenship or rights. Now, James Buchanan was raised not far from where we lived. He was born in Franklin County, Pennsylvania, so our newspapers were regularly filled with things that he said or did. And I remember my father reading to my mother Buchanan's inaugural address, because, of course, James Buchanan won that election. And one of the things he said was that the dispute over slavery in the territories, the new territories, needed to be settled soon. It was becoming too divisive an issue, and a lot of people were concerned that it would lead to a split in the country as a whole. Buchanan was saying we needed to solve that problem, and he had a solution. He knew that it was coming. Well, I knew those names, Millard Fillmore and James Buchanan, from my experiences with the parade. But I soon heard the adults around me saying another name, Dred Scott. And that was not a name I'd heard before. But listening to the conversation, I learned that Dred Scott was an enslaved man who had crossed into free territory, a free state. But because he had crossed back into a slave state, his case had come up through the various courts to the Supreme Court, and Justice Taney wrote the majority opinion for the court. All of this was in the newspaper, although I didn't read it myself until many years later in books. But Justice Taney spoke for the majority, saying that slaves have no rights as citizens, their property. And in addition to that, slavery could not be prohibited in the territories. Well, that upset my parents and various other people who worried that things would get much worse for them than they already were. It was difficult to make a living, although we did live in an area that was fairly tolerant of our people, and we had some good neighbors. I guess one of the things you want to hear about is how we lived. Well, my father died when I was but 8 years old. And it might have been that his work outside year-round with very little accommodation for foul weather or health emergencies took a toll on the man. He was only 39 when he died. And my mother had a very difficult time when we lost him. She was ill herself for more than a year, and within 3 years, she died. I well remember the night that we lost her. And Mother dead, I well understood that I and Peter were orphans. Now, we were rescued by my mother's brother, Uncle Peter Williams, my beloved Uncle Peter and Aunt Caroline, and their daughters, our cousins, Lizzie, who was a very talented, kind, and gifted music student, and my younger cousin, Sadie, witty, and an outdoor girl, a lot of fun for me. We were closer in age than I was to Elizabeth. Uncle Peter came from Brooklyn and took us home to live with them. Now, Lizzie and Sadie were very light-complexioned, and they were accepted at the only school available in Brooklyn, a white school. But there was a problem because Peter and I were obviously colored, and that school would not accept us. But Uncle Peter had a lot of friends, some of who were educators, people he discussed politics with on a regular basis. And he had a little bit of disposable income that he was willing to dispose of for our benefit. So he placed us at the New York Colored Orphans Asylum across the river, across the Hudson, in Manhattan. And this was a 4-story building, a full New York City square block from 43rd to 44th Streets along Fifth Avenue, serving 300 mostly freeborn colored children, founded by Quakers, the Society of Friends, and over 100 years, from 1836 until 1936, it was under the care of several Quaker meetings. It did last a few years beyond that. Some of you may have heard me tell stories about the New York Colored Orphans Asylum and my affection for the faculty and the staff there and the education that I received. If you have heard any of those stories, you've probably also heard me talk about the New York Colored Orphans Asylum being burned to the ground in 1863 during the New York City draft riots by an angry mob carrying guns, clubs, whatever they could lay their hands on. You may have heard me talk about Chief O'Brien of the New York Fire Department, who was killed on the steps of the building trying to keep the mob from entering the institution. The building was sacked and burned to the ground. 300 children were escorted out the back gates, rescued by a contingent of brave policemen and private citizens who escorted us to refuge at the 35th Street Police Station, where we were moored, basically, for 3 days. July 13th, 1863, until July 15th, 1863, when the first Zouaves, veterans from the Gettysburg battle that was going on that week, arrived in New York. But before we got to the 35th Street Police Station, we children saw a colored man hanging dead from a lamppost. We saw barrels of oil set ablaze and pushed against the sides of buildings. We saw public buildings demolished by the mob. We saw homes broken into and people dragged from within. Abolitionists and colored people, of course, were the targets. When the Zouaves arrived wearing interesting uniforms modeled on Moroccan soldiers fighting for the French, they escorted us through the gang members of the mob, all of them armed, to police gunboats and took us to safety at Blackwell Island in the East River. Now, the scene of that, the harbor there, was as distressing nearly as what we had seen back in the city, because there were 2,000 colored people on the island, distressed, parents yelling for their children, running up and down, looking for them, children sitting alone, bereft. Dozens of colored people had been killed in those days when there was no law enforcement in the city. All soldiers had been sent to Gettysburg. And some of the people there were there for 4 months and longer because they were homeless now and there was nowhere else to go. We children were taken to a dilapidated shell of a building that eventually was renovated. So we fared pretty well, those of us from the orphanage, and we did not lose a single child until we got to the island, and a few died of dysentery and other illnesses. But my education continued at the New York Colored Orphans Asylum, and you may have heard me talk about the choir that I sang for while I was there, and the tours we did up and down the Atlantic seaboard, singing for other children and churches and educational institutions. I was grateful and happy for the education I had there. I studied American history, I studied music and literature, and in particular, we did learn about the Constitution, and at one time I could have recited all the amendments up to that time for you, but please do not ask me to recite them now. One of the experiences that I had at the orphanage that meant a lot to me was to hear Frederick Douglass speak. He came to talk to the children. And he was, of course, up on the stage, and he had no idea who I was, but it moved me a great deal to hear him talk about the importance of education and what we would be able to do with our education if we paid attention. He was inspiring. It's hard to know where to go next. I've got 3 competing stories that I'd like to tell you, and I'm trying to calculate here. I guess I will end with a story about Mr. Douglass himself. When I left the institution for good, shortly after the end of the Civil War, I was apprenticed to a barber in Susquehanna Depot, Pennsylvania, which is just across the state line from Binghamton, New York, Susquehanna County, Pennsylvania. And my master barber, my employer, was a Mr. Samuel T. Johnston. Now, Mr. Johnston and his family lived in the town. He was a colored man, a colored barber. But this was a somewhat prejudiced town, and no other black man was allowed to remain in the town overnight. I was accepted as a member of Mr. Johnston's family, and that's how I was allowed to stay there with him, but no one else. Well, Mr. Johnston was corresponding with Mr. Frederick Douglass, and he sent a request for Mr. Douglass to come and speak at the hall, Nichols Hall in Susquehanna. And Mr. Douglass was on tour at the time and agreed to come. Now, Mr. Johnston had some handbills printed up, about 100 of them, and it was my task to carry them around and put them up with paste. So I had my bucket and my brush and the roll of bills under my arm. And every time I stopped to put up one of these posters, a crowd of boys and men, young men, very young men, white boys and men, would follow along behind me shouting and tear down the poster. They were not going to let any nigger speak in this town. And they made such a commotion that they quite well advertised the event for us. We really didn't mind that the posters had been taken down because everyone in town heard them shouting and came to find out who was the nigger who was going to be speaking in town. And of course, everybody knew Frederick Douglass's name, whether you were an abolitionist or not. He was in the papers regularly. Pictures of him were in many, many publications. Well, I was very excited and looking forward to this. Mr. Johnston, however, began to be a bit worried about the possible outcome, given the reception by the youngsters and the young men, who of course could be troublemakers if they chose to. So one of his friends, one of the upstanding citizens of the town with whom he was friendly, came to visit and suggested that he telegraph to Mr. Douglass to come on the train the night before, the night train. And that's what Mr. Johnston did. And in due time, Mr. Douglass arrived on the train and was hustled quietly off to Mr. Johnston's house. I must be touching one of these gizmos that they have put on me. I apologize for that. That and this mask, which they tell me is protecting me and protecting you, and I did live through that great epidemic of influenza. And so I understand the danger, but I am confused by all these noises. I'm sorry. Well, Mr. Douglass arrived on the night train, was hustled to Mr. Johnston's house, and those gangs of boys and men spent the entire day at the train station, boarding every train that came in, waving their clubs and shouting about where was the nigger, and they were not going to let him speak, and we would see about all this. Well, when time came for the speeches, Mr. Young, Lawyer Young, came to Mr. Douglass and Mr. Johnston and suggested that the four of them, those three and one more man who was very much in support of having Mr. Douglass speak, a white man, that they should go and enter by the rear of the hall and send another man to the front to see if they could quiet the crowd, because a good hour and a half before the scheduled speech, the hall was full, not even standing room. And most of the people there were armed with onions, potatoes, turnips, and some rocks and cudgels, but no ladies present. The ladies feared that there would be trouble, and they stayed away. Well, as we approached the hour, the crowd, of course, was restless and was shouting some of the same things. Bring out your nigger! And where is that darky? And all of a sudden, Mr. Douglass came striding out upon the stage, holding up his hands. And Lawyer Young had been standing there about to say something to the crowd to try and quiet them, and Mr. Douglass just moved him to the side. But he had been talking, orating the whole time as he paced across the stage. And would you believe that everyone in the hall suddenly became very quiet? They wanted to hear what this man had to say. And Frederick Douglass held forth for a good hour and some. And when he was finished, the crowd jumped up and yelled, "Go on, go on." And so he did. And when they finally let him stop speaking, some of those very angry young men and boys took off their hats and took up a collection for Mr. Douglass. They put their hats up on the stage with more than $300 in total. And then, goodness gracious, and then they rushed up on the stage to shake Mr. Douglass's hands and pat him on the back and thank him for coming. It's this little thing right here that's making all that noise. I'll try not to touch it. So Mr. Douglass was warmly received, and when they finally let him escape out the back door, he was taken back to Mr. Johnston's. Of the leading citizens came by to shake his hand that night. But the next morning, more people came. I'd say close to 100 people came through Mr. Johnston's house just to say hello to Mr. Douglass. And in the evening, there was a reception. These were all white people, and a more congenial and honorable group of people I had never seen. They were really pleased to be there and to have those conversations with Mr. Douglass. But then the music began. Someone was playing the piano, and Mr. Douglass took out his violin, and the dancing commenced. And so I am proud to say that I was able to dance to Mr. Frederick Douglass's own music. I'm going to stop there. I do have a little bit of a story about some of the legislation. Maybe I should just take everything off. But this is the time where you get to ask me questions. And when you are finished asking me questions, then I will leave, and my great-granddaughter will come back, and you can ask her some questions as well. That's the young man who's going to help the audience ask your questions.
Is it true that you would have had the right to vote legally? Were you able to vote in Pennsylvania in those days?
in some of the states that was possible, but not in Pennsylvania while I was there. The first election that I voted in was 1872, and President Grant was the incumbent, and Horace Greeley was running against him. It was an interesting campaign for each of them, but they were not nearly as interesting. In fact, in spite of both being characters themselves, as the third party candidates, who were Virginia Woodhull, the suffragist, running for president before women had the franchise. And her running mate was Mr. Frederick Douglass. I'm not sure he was entirely enthusiastic about the prospect. He did no campaigning whatsoever, but he did get a few votes. I don't think he got any electoral, I don't think they got any electoral votes, but it was certainly interesting to listen to people talk about them. And of course, I believe Horace Greeley died just before the votes were counted, or just before the electoral votes were counted. That's my memory. That was a long time ago. That's the first election that I remember participating. Other questions? That was just after I married, also Mrs. Barnes, and I was a bit distracted, so I didn't participate much. I did read a lot about Mr. Frederick Douglass because, of course, I was interested in him and had met him. Mr. Douglass also stayed at my house with myself and Mrs. Barnes many years later when he was doing another one of his lecture tours. And that was wonderful. We had him to ourselves for a few hours of the evening that he was with us. And having Frederick to Olean, New York, which was where we lived by then, that in itself was a bit wonderful. Of course, he was living in New York State then. Any other questions? Ma'am?
Was your father able to maintain any contact with any of the other 19 Barnes slaves that he had left with?
According to my father, once they disappeared over the hill, they never saw each other. Well, Jerry Barnes, who was in the town of Lewistown for a while, they were in contact, but eventually Jerry Barnes left Lewistown as well, which was not entirely a bad thing from my father's perspective, because Lewistown was, of course, known for harboring runaways, fugitives, and my father, having his manumission papers, he did not believe that would necessarily protect him. So he was not unhappy to be one of the few colored men in town. There was a black community there. I grew up in a black community in Lewistown, but I don't know that anyone else, as far as I knew, there were no other former enslaved people there, and they wouldn't have told me about it as a child, so there may have been, but I was not aware of that. I think what grieved my father most, aside from his fear about being taken away again to Virginia, to Maryland, was that he didn't know where he came from. He could not have found his parents if he wanted to, or any of his family, or even the place where he came from. He really didn't know any of that. My mother's family had been in Lewistown for a few generations. So, in fact, her father helped to found a church there. And so we were definitely welcomed into the town and had good connections there. And I came back to Tidiute, which was not too far from Lewistown, when I opened my first barber shop myself with 2 chairs, which I was quite proud of at the time. I did a lot of reading in my time. I didn't tell you about the library in my barber shop, the lending library in the barber shop. Had several thousand volumes by the time I got to Olean, and the longest wall in the shop was devoted to books, and they could be on loan out to members of the community as long as I knew where to find you. It was fine for people to borrow books, and we didn't lose very many. And that's one of the things I'm proud of, that we put a lot of books out for people to read, including a lot of books by African American writers, magazines, pamphlets, but actual books as well. One of the sponsors this morning or yesterday afternoon asked me to say a few words about Plessy versus Ferguson in the Supreme Court, and I can say a little bit, but what the library reminds me of is that Albion, you're going to have to help me, Tourget, who was lead counsel for Mr. Plessy when he was arrested for riding in a white railroad car in Louisiana. He was a man of white and black parentage, but under the law in Louisiana, it didn't matter if he had any black blood at all. He wasn't allowed to ride in a white car. And it was a test case that was brought on purpose, trying to get it to the Supreme Court to try to get the law thrown out. Albion Tourget was another Louisianan who took the case, agreed to take the case. And I mention him because he became a novelist when he gave up law. And I had a whole shelf of just Tourget books. And of course, he was originally from Western New York and lived in Rochester and actually helped us erect the Frederick Douglass Monument in 1895 when Mr. Douglass died. And that's a long rambling aside. That had nothing to do with your question. Did I see another hand? No? If there are more questions, I'm going to sit down. If not, I'll just wave as I exit the stage. Anyone else? Have you been able to hear me this evening? Oh, that's good. I did worry about this mask. I'm glad it worked. Well, I have some books up here that my great-granddaughter wants you to see, but I'm going to exit here, and I think she's probably backstage, and she will likely come out in a moment. If you have, I'm sure you have questions for her, because she understands more. At least I hope she understands more of this than I do. Excuse me. Thank you. try not to touch my microphone as I unbutton my top button. Do you have any questions for me? I hope that you learned something from my great-grandfather. I never know what he's going to say. It doesn't matter what we've talked about beforehand. He talks about what's on his mind at the moment, and it's not always the same thing as what we've talked about. I do love having him here. He's a little irascible. Well, my father told Henry Barnes stories and Thomas Henry Barnes stories. We call him T.H. The family calls him T.H. And he's definitely the patriarch, even though we know about Henry. T.H. was the patriarch. My dad grew up with him. My father's father died when my dad was 11, and there were 8 kids in his family, so they all moved in with T.H. Barnes. And T.H. was a big influence on my father's life. So I heard these stories from the time I was 3 and 4 years old. My dad told me bedtime stories from Henry's life and T.H.'s life, and some Frederick Douglass stories as well. So T.H. is in here. When I first decided I would tell a T.H. Barnes story at our family reunion. The Barnes family meets every summer, usually in Western New York, Buffalo, Jamestown, Olean. But now that we are the elders, my generation, our kids want to go at more exciting places. So we go to North Carolina, and we've been to Baltimore and Virginia Beach. When I decided I would tell a T.H. Barnes story at the family reunion, I was very excited, and when I talked about that with friends here, I got the question, why would you want to tell a story about a man? Why don't you tell a story about one of your female relatives? And that kind of puzzled me, because there aren't nearly that many stories about the women on that side of the family as there are about T.H. and his sons. His sons are my great uncles, so my dad's mother was one of T.H.'s children, his only daughter. And I know stories about her from my aunts, but I don't have a written document to draw from to remind me of the stories that I heard. There's just not as much material. And it never occurred to me that I shouldn't tell his story. So when I started telling his stories outside the family, then I really got questions like, why would you want to portray a man? Why don't you start with one of the women? And it's because that's where the stories are. And he really is in here. So it doesn't feel like a stretch to me. I mean, I agonize a little bit. Should I cut my hair? Should I tie my hair up? But when I'm doing him, it doesn't feel awkward. I feel like he really is talking. And one of my storytelling mentors taught me to ask permission to come into character, and not once I am in character, I don't leave him until I ask permission and step back. So it feels good to me, and it feels like what I'm supposed to be doing. And Eileen Evans, who lives up in Garrett County, she's originally from Ohio, and she portrays a lot of different characters, mostly African-American women. And she has said from the beginning, she said, if you feel like you can do it, you should do it. And there's nobody else that can tell those stories the same way. There are lots of great-grands like me, but most of them were not raised on these stories. Most of them barely know who T.H. Barnes is. In fact, when I'm at the reunion, I have people of all ages coming up to me and saying, now, tell me about T.H.'s friend, or tell me about T.H.'s mother, or they come and say, how am I related to T.H.? And I have to draw a picture, and for people I know. There are lots of people I don't know. Now, there are usually about 100 of us sometimes. In a really good year, there's 150, but it's usually more like 100. And lately, of course, we didn't have a reunion the past 2 years. So we're already planning for 2022. Anybody else? Yeah.
First of all, I want to thank you so much for area, I don't know if this, since you've been back, ooh, that really sounds loud, back in the area, are there any descendants from the original Reverend Barnes? Or, okay, I was wondering if there'd be any
Well,
family contact with his.
Okay, so here's the part where I step away from telling family stories to tell you what the historians tell me. Do you know Dennis Fry and John Fry, the father and son historians? Yeah. They tell me that they've not been able to find any information in Washington County of an escape of that many men. They say if there had been that many men who left Hagerstown in the middle of the night in 1835, it would have been on the front page for days, for weeks even. And they can't find anything. So they think that it was much more likely that Henry Barnes escaped from the Eastern Shore and said Hagerstown so he wouldn't be traced if anybody heard the story. And that makes sense to me. And I do have two friends who have family named Barnes on the Eastern Shore, and they would love for me to come. Someday I'll get a week and I'll go. That's my husband with the camera. He didn't hear that. Don't repeat that to him. But I do hope to get there sometime. The other thing about Barneses in this county is that one of my dad's cousins, 7 aunts, I think of them as aunts because they're all the generation, they're all my dad's generation, even though they're cousins. Several of them have been several times to Clear Spring, to the Barnes farm in Clear Spring, and they were told by their uncle, Darwin, who's my father's uncle, it's Darwin who's my dad's cousin. These are my dad's second cousins, these women. But he says that Uncle Dar filled them with stories about us being related to Light Horse Harry, who fought in the Revolution and was related to Robert E. Lee. And that's that farm. The Clear Spring farm is a Lee farm. And so that side of the family, there were 7 girls and 2 boys, and they all had multiple kids. So that is the biggest branch of the family. My grandmother, my dad's mother, only had 8 children, whereas they had at least 9, I think. And so my dad doesn't hold with any of that. He doesn't think those are the same Barneses. And they've been to the Clear Spring farm a couple times, and they've gone through the records, and they haven't found anything about a Henry. There's nothing about escapes or anything like that. But that was how they made sense of the stories they had been told. Now, they didn't have the manuscript. My dad had a handwritten manuscript that T.H. Barnes wrote in 1824. That's what this is. 1824 is when he started it, and he worked on it for a long time, so it wasn't all written at the same time. He wrote it for the New York Colored Orphans Asylum when they had their 100-year anniversary. I guess 1924 was their 75th. Does that work out in years if it was started in 1836? And then he worked on it over the years, and they kept having him come back. He was one of the two oldest former, he calls them inmates. That was the standard language. They were inmates of the New York Colored Orphans Asylum. And these 2 older men, so he was, in 1924 when they found him, he was born in 1849, so he was 75, right? Math is not my strong suit. And the other man's name is John Doran, and that's in here. And John Doran thought he had been told that the institution burned to the ground in 1863, so he thought there was no one left. And he was promised money. He was apprenticed to a farmer, or there's another word, it's like an apprenticeship, but it's agricultural work. And he was mistreated, he was beaten, he lost his hearing in one ear, and lost use of one leg. He was really abused. He was frostbitten. They put him in a barn in the wintertime, and he lost several toes to frostbite. So, and somebody took the farmer to court, and there was a settlement, but he didn't think he could get the money because he thought the orphanage had burned down. So they reconnected when they were in their 70s. I think John Doran was 74 and T.H. was 75, and there was a huge reunion, and they weren't all that great friends. I mean, they knew each other, but they were not best buddies, but now they were the only ones left from their class. And so they became very close, and they saw each other a lot, even though they were, I think he lived in New York City. Your question was? In Washington County. Not that I know of, and once I heard from John Fry and Dennis Fry that it was not likely, I mean, for the same reason, it's not likely he came from Clear Spring either, because it still would have been in the paper here. So someday I will get to the Eastern Shore and do some research down there. So I tell the story as it was told to me. It's a family story. But then when people ask questions like that, then I feel like, well, I have to tell you what else I know. So I mostly tell the parts that make sense to me, that sound, I mean, there's some things in the book that I wouldn't tell. There's some really bad jokes about Irishmen drinking and saying things about niggers. You know, I wouldn't tell those stories, but I put them in here because he had them in his, T.H. had them in his book, and I'm not going to censor him if people want to read about it. I'm ambivalent about that. And I also don't use all that language. If there had been children here, I would have used the word darky and said, but that's not what they really said. They really said a word that begins with N. And most kids would know what that was, but I wouldn't say it out loud. I told that story about Frederick Douglass's speech at a festival where there was a child, and I didn't see the child because they were down underneath until I was halfway through that story. It's, oh my God, that child's going to run out of here yelling those words. And they didn't, so I was okay, but I do worry about that. Any other questions? Bearing in mind that I tend to ramble, so if you ask me a question, I might go off on it. Yeah.
Do you have any younger relatives or generations in your family who are interested in continuing the storytelling?
Yeah, most of the interest comes from people my age or a little younger, and there's enough people interested that now I'm getting stories. I just found out about my, so the short answer to that, just to get you an answer, is that the kids are ambivalent. Just getting that, so when you're in a room with 100 people and it's after dinner, I figure I've got 3 minutes to tell a story. After that, everybody's tired. They don't want to hear, even the adults don't want to hear more than a 3-minute story. If I'm talking one-on-one or in a small group, I can tell lots of stories, but my usual venue is after dinner. They'll say, Fanny, tell us about the orphanage. Nobody knows about the orphanage. So I'll tell them a story. The kids, because I'm portraying an old man and I'm talking funny, they don't know what to make of me at all. They collapse in giggles, and the grown-ups are like grabbing them and yanking them up, and they just stare at me. So it takes like 4 or 5 times, and then I have to talk. And they may not know me at all. It may be their first time at a reunion. The kids that know me are slightly older, so the 15-year-olds won't do that. If they don't want to hear it, they'll just leave. It's like the 10 to 13-year-olds that don't know what to do. And the same thing happens in schools. The first time, it hasn't happened to me very often, but it has happened. Sometimes I'll go to a community center, and the kids have never heard this kind of storytelling unless they heard it in school. So the ones that have heard it are fine, but if they haven't, they don't know what to do. And when I tell this story, I pass around pictures of my family and pictures of my nuclear family, pictures of my extended family, pictures of the reunion, and I always get more than one child who wants to know what I'm doing with all those black people. I've already told my story. I've told a child's version of TH, and I've explained who I am and all of that, and there's still kids who just can't, and it's not just white kids. Black kids ask me that question. It's like, explain yourself. You make no sense to me. And those are wonderful conversations, because I can get them there, but it takes a while. They need a lot of talking. And, well, who's this? Well, who's that? Well, who's that? Well, she doesn't look anything like you. You know, well, don't you have relatives who don't look like you? But the grown-ups are really interested, not everybody, but there are people who are now on their own exploration journeys. And my cousin, Michael, the son of my father's youngest my father had three brothers, sorry, and Uncle Paul's the last of the siblings. He's 99 this year. I haven't seen him for 3 years because we didn't have reunions during COVID. His son Michael called to tell me that he found a lynching victim in the family. So my father's father, who married T.H.'s Barnes' daughter, John Crawford, was a barber, came to Olean to live as a barber, met Mabel Cinderella Barnes, and married her, and she became Mabel Cinderella Barnes Crawford. And, but nobody knew where he came from. My great-grandmother, Mabel Cinderella's mother, according to my dad, didn't like any of her children's spouses. None of them were good enough for her kids. John Crawford, never really explained where he came from. And apparently there was a rumor that he had another family in Bath, New York. And my Aunt Thelma, my father's the sister closest to him in age, older, went to visit. She found that family, and they wouldn't speak to her. But they admitted that they were John Crawford's kids. And they weren't supposed to know about that. So he was a bit of a rake. And he died young. He died at about 40. My father says he drank himself to death, by which he means beer. That was mostly what he drank, but he drank a lot of it. Anyway, John Crawford, Michael Crawford tells me that he found John Crawford's family. Now I'm going to get mixed up about the states. I think it's in, it's either Indiana, Kentucky, or Tennessee. I'm sorry, because I do so much research and I go off on these wild goose chases, and then I can't remember who goes with what. But he went to the African American Museum, the Smithsonian Museum, African American Museum, and went through their genealogical database, and he found Anthony Crawford as the uncle of John Crawford, who was a barber in this tiny little town. And when there was a lynching, Anthony Crawford died by the noose, killed by white people, white farmers who wanted his land. He was a very successful farmer. He had a lot of land and a lot of money, and they were angry. And it was the same time that Tulsa was happening, and lots of towns were being torched, and successful black people driven off their land. So this is sometime after Reconstruction. And when Anthony Crawford was murdered, all the black people in that county left en masse, like within a week. They all fled. And John Crawford came with his family to I can't remember which state they came to, but Michael found him there, and from there traced him to Olean, New York, by way of Bath. So he did a lot of research, and he's sure that that's the guy. Of course, Grandpa John has been dead since 1911, 1922, sorry. So we're not gonna find a lot more, but there are people that are interested. And so I haven't told I don't know anything more about that story about Anthony Crawford, except that I went to the Lynching Memorial. I was in Montgomery, Alabama, for the National Association of Black Storytellers, and one of the things they offered us was a tour of all the museums and monuments in Montgomery. And I didn't buy a ticket in time, so the bus was full. And then somebody gave me a ticket, but the vice president of the Baltimore chapter of National Association of Black Storytellers, we call it NABS, the Griot Circle is the Baltimore chapter, and she didn't have a ticket. And I was not going to get on the bus if she didn't have a ticket. So I gave her my ticket, and then I actually walked all the way around Montgomery to see all the, and I kept running into them because they were all there, and a lot of people didn't have tickets, so there were other people that I ran into, and it was a great day. But the two museums that blew me away was the Lynching Memorial, which is not really a museum. It's rows and rows of hanging metal slabs, thousands of them. I think there's 3,000 or something, each one commemorating someone who was lynched in the United States between really early and when they basically stopped lynching people, which was not that long ago. There were lynchings in Maryland as late as 1930, and there were some after that. So I saw Anthony Crawford's name, but it never occurred to me that I would be related to him. And that was before Michael told me that story. So that was important to me. And it was really moving, just seeing rows and rows and rows, and everyone has a name and a date. Some of the dates have question marks next to them, or some of the names are not, they don't have both names, or they don't have they have the place too on them. And then I also went to Equal Justice Project in Montgomery, which is, it starts with slave history, and you walk in, and there are glass booths that you walk by, and there are people talking inside the recorded voices inside the booths, and some representation of a person. Some of them are children, some of them are women, some of them are men. They're all desperate one way or another, and it's a long period of time for all those people. So you're being accosted by people asking you for help, or they're not even asking for anything, they're just crying. And there's a card that tells you who they are, where they got this information, who they are, why they're crying. And that's what the first thing you see. You walk through this hall, and I was crying by the time I got to the end of the hall. And then you go through a lot of other historical exhibits, and you end with the prison project. What's the name of the prison in Alabama? But it has a name that comes from somewhere else. Angola prison. There are interviews with prisoners from and talking about the same kinds of situations, people being abused or unlawfully incarcerated, just telling them. And they've all been researched, so the people who made the films are, if they're innocent, they're convinced they're innocent. So not all of them are innocent, but they're all over punished one way or another. And so you leave there and you're just So compared to that, the Lynching Memorial was calmer because you're just by yourself. There are other people in there with you, but you're not talking. You're just looking at the names and walking through, and it's peaceful, it's quiet. And these people have been dead a long time. Some of those people that you're talking to or listening to are alive now. And so it was hard. The Rosa Parks Museum was fun because it has a happy ending and it's made for children. So there's nothing like that in the Rosa Parks Museum. And there was someplace else too, but I can't remember all of it. It was an amazing week. It was my third NABS conference. No. It was my fifth NABS conference. So I knew a lot of people there, and it was fun by then. whose question was I not answering? Okay. Anything else? Okay. Okay, so I sort of answered that, but didn't say enough. So I've been hearing Hagerstown from the time I was 3 as the place where my ancestor came from. And so I went to the University of Chicago, and I graduated from high school, went to Chicago to go to school, and didn't quite graduate. I was almost graduated, but I had 3 incompletes. So, and I was tired of, I didn't need any more coursework. And my friends who were in my class were leaving. And so I had a friend who had a house in Annandale. And Maryland was not scary to me. I came from Pennsylvania. I had thought about going to college in Oregon, but when I calculated how many times I could come home in a year, having to fly from Oregon, that didn't sound necessarily like a good idea. So Chicago was halfway. I could drive from Chicago. So Maryland as a destination, or Annandale, Virginia as a destination, Annandale's town is what I was thinking is I would like to see Hagerstown. I'd never been there, here. And so I ended up with friends in Annandale, and I quickly realized, like within 24 hours, that I didn't want to live in Annandale. And we found a house in Boomsboro, which was Washington County. We just made a circle of the places we would be interested in moving to, and this was within the circle. And I did live in Frederick for a while, or outside Frederick for a while, but came back. I first got here in 1971, or the beginning of fall 72, I guess, or fall 71, fall 71. Is that right? Yes. Yeah.
So you're kind of in an unusual situation where you know exactly who owned your ancestors.
Well, I don't know.
Well, you like Reverend Barnes.
Right, but I haven't found him.
What are your feelings on him?
Exactly what T.H. says, which is that he gave my great-grandfather an incredible gift of an education and a trade that allowed him to become a successful family man and working man. He supported himself and his family. His health was never good. I mean, it wasn't awful when he was young. He was okay. But, gardening outside year-round so you can sell seeds and take care of that land and then work for other people so you have enough cash, it's not a cushy job, but it is a way to make a living, and he was good at it. So it was a gift. It was absolutely a gift. And when you have a slave owner who has 19 slaves and is already rich and doesn't free them until he's dying, that's a moral quandary for me. It's not, I mean, I do understand how it happens. I'm not giving away my money either, but I'm not rich. It's like, watching multimillionaires or billionaires still intent on making money. What's the point? Why don't you do something useful? But it is a gift, and that gift of writing probably led to T.H. being able to write that book. It was a handwritten manuscript of 100 pages that all fit in that little book. I asked for $15 for the book if anybody's interested. That's the 3rd edition because we keep improving it, correcting the misspellings and more pictures and things like that. Of Henry? Of Henry Barnes, of Reverend Barnes, you mean? No, the only evidence I have of Reverend Barnes is T.H.'s written story that he heard from his father. But his father, yeah. I mean, I'm more interested in Henry's parents than I am Reverend Barnes. I appreciate that Reverend Barnes educated Henry and helped him to be self-sufficient enough to, marry and support his family and make a contribution to the community. He was respected in Lewistown. He was a member of 2 churches, I think. I'm not that curious about Reverend Barnes. I would like to find out where Henry came from, because that's a way of finding more family members or people or some record of him that would give us more information. And it would be nice to know that Reverend Barnes was a real person, that he didn't make him up. Once you begin to suspect that the whole story is not true, then you begin to suspect that maybe all parts of the story aren't true. And so it would be nice to find documentation. And that's why the people who live in the Eastern Shore who have Barneses in their family, they want me to come because they want to see if there's a connection. And if there's not a connection, they will learn more about Barneses anyway, just from me going through records. We did find, when I was in my, maybe about 30, I went with my parents to Lewistown, PA, and the librarian at the Historical Society was wonderful. She sat with us for about 4 hours and brought out census records from 1835 and 1830, and the town did a census in 1835, but they were all town census. There was no U.S. census. It was all handwritten in a ledger. And we found the family. We found T.H. and Mary Bell. I never told you my great-grandmother's name is Mary Bell. Mary Bell Peoples Lot Barnes. Mary Bell, who married T.H., was the daughter of John and Rose Lott in Tiddioute, Pennsylvania, which is a different county, but not far from Lewistown, and that's where he had his first, or it might have been his second barbershop. But Mary Bell's mother was named Cinderella. She was Cinderella Lott, who married a Peoples. We don't know what happened to Mr. Peoples. I think he died. And Mary Bell became a maid on a riverboat on the Missouri River and died under mysterious circumstances. T.H. tried to find out how she died, and he found her personal effects, her clothing, at a, I don't remember which sisters it is, but nuns hospital in a town along the Missouri had her stuff, and he went and got it, but nobody knew how she died. So her parents, Cinderella's parents, raised Mary Bell. And Mary Bell and her aunt, who were almost the same age, were together at home with the grandparents when T.H. Barnes, who had a barbershop and was the only black businessman in Tiddioute, John Lott, the grandfather, came to the door. He was a teamster, drove mules carrying oil in the oil. Tiddioute was an oil field town. And he came to meet this black man who had just moved to town because he had 2 girls he had to marry off. And he wanted Mary Bell gone first because he thought she would be more difficult to get married. I think that's kind of the way T.H. tells it. I think they had that kind of funny, they joked a lot, but that's how they took out their tensions, was telling stories like that. So that part in the book is pretty funny. Again, I forgot the question. You were asking, I think, about Reverend Barnes. Do I have evidence of Reverend Barnes? And I don't. And then I got sidetracked because I hadn't told you anything about Mary Bell. And I do want to tell the women's stories. I'm sure it was, if there were 19, it would have been in the newspaper somewhere. It's just a question of finding where. So right? But they were followed, according to Henry. I don't think, if it's not an entirely truthful story, I don't think T.H. changed the story. No, I mean, it doesn't matter. He's gone. My father always said that Henry thought of himself as a fugitive. There are photographs of everybody, all the ancestors, people that were not related to at all, who lived in Lewistown, people that were not related to, who lived in Tidiute. There's tons of photographs, a lot of them with no names on them. But there's no Henry. And my father always said Henry thought of himself as a fugitive slave, so he would never let his picture be taken. Now, he was long gone when my dad was born, but that's what my dad picked up from his grandfather. I feel like I'm holding you captive. Was that another question, Billy? I'm telling at the Smithsburg Public Library for the Smithsburg Historical Society on Tuesday, this coming Tuesday at 7. Masks required, including me. So you won't see, I'm thinking this is all fogged up and you can't see my lips anyway, but it is helpful. And I'm going to ask if I can wear this mask because it's better than the ones that the one that the library offered me. So I might tell one of these stories that I've already told, but I'll also tell different stories because that wouldn't be fair otherwise. Anything else you want to say about? And as a special bonus, Billy, this is Billy Sue Boyer from the Historical Society, and she's heard me tell before, she would like me to end the program on Tuesday with a totally different story. She wants me to come out of character as T.H. and tell a story about my little brother that I call the frog story. That is a funny story, but I have not agreed to do that yet. But since some of you... It could be a what? Encore? Yeah, I could do an encore. If they sit as long as you guys did, I could tell 5 more stories. But I'm still thinking about how to do that. I'm trying to think if... I know, you've already told me that. But you've asked me 2 or 3 times, so I'm trying to think of how to do it. And it's a great story, but it's a 20-minute story usually. And I don't want to take 20 minutes to tell it as an encore. So if I can think of a way to get it down to 7 minutes, I would tell it. It was one of the first stories I ever told. Thank you, Jeannie. And TH thanks you. You're a great audience, by the way. Yes, yeah. 15, And I also have little forms that if you don't want to do it tonight, my information is on there so you could, I was going to put out business cards too, I think.